One of the things I miss about our Kesher Beit Midrash services is sometimes I'll pass out a source sheet or we'll do a discussion. And I was able to do that some when we were on Zoom, but I hadn't really figured out how to do it. And then I decided, you know what, we can learn together if I get the source sheet out ahead of time. So those of you at home, there was a link in the email that went out to the source sheet I'm using. Thanks to Rabbi David Winship, who compiled some of these sources. I figured we could look at these together. Those in the room, I think you should have a copy of these. We talked about blessing earlier and the importance of blessing and preparedness of the community, but I want to focus actually on the section that we heard chanted today, and that is the section leading up to the moments of blessing instead of curses, and that is Bilaam's relationship with his ass, which was not so great. This aton, this she-donkey that he was with, she and Bilaam have a complex relationship. And we hear about this as Bilaam, having been charged by Balak ben Paor to go and curse the people. As he's going on his way, the donkey tries to prevent this from happening. Now, it's not really the donkey's doing. It's actually this malach, this angel of God, that is standing in the path. And the donkey can see the malach, but Bilaam, being blind in various ways, cannot. And I think there's something profound and satirical about this, right? Here is this prophet, right, who is actually an effective prophet who seems to be able to communicate with God directly, and whose blessings come true and whose curses come true, and yet he can't see a projection of the divine into the world. I think that's very intentional in the story. So I want to take you through this with an eye toward considering animal welfare. What does our tradition have to say about how we treat animals? Not only how did Bilaam do it wrong, but what can we learn from our tradition about how we might interact with the non-human animal kingdom? So it starts, Vayiftach Adonai et pi ha'aton. So the Lord opened the ass's mouth, and she said to Bilaam. Now this is the only example we have in Torah of a talking animal. Really interesting. There are a lot of other mythical traditions from various cultures around the world where talking animals show up quite frequently, but it's not the case for us, probably for reasons of idolatry and concern about creatures acting in ways that they ought not to act. But here we do have an example of a talking animal. And what does she say? What have I done to you that you have beaten me these 3 times? Bilaam said to the ass, you have made a mockery of me. If I had a sword with me, I'd kill you. So he really doubles down in this moment. And you got to think, what's with this guy? It's one thing to beat the donkey, but when the donkey starts talking to you and says, hey, maybe this is not the best reflection of our relationship as owner and donkey. Bilaam says, well, I would kill you if I could. The ass said to Bilaam, look, I love this response. I am the I am the ass that you have been riding along until this day. Have I been the habit of doing this thus to you? Look, Bilaam, I've been a pretty good donkey, right? I'm pretty responsive. I'm pretty helpful to you. I do all the things you ask of me or command me to do. It's not common for me to veer off the road. Maybe there's a reason for this. Have you thought about that? And at this moment, Bilaam finally starts to get it a little bit and says, right, Vayomer lo. Oh, okay, fair point. I guess you have been a pretty good donkey. And now, skipping ahead a little bit, we have the angel of the Lord said to him, right? Because God is now going to say, this is not just about how the donkey feels about your behavior, but there's something greater. This is actually about how God feels about this behavior. Why have you beaten your ass these 3 times? It is I who came out as an adversary, for the errand is obnoxious to me. And when the ass saw me, she shied away because of me those 3 times. If she had not shied away from me, you are the one I should have killed while sparing her. You think that you should threaten the aton? Actually, Bilaam, guess what? You're the one who actually deserves the natural consequence here, right? The proportional response to your behavior to the animal, which is actually quite remarkable if you think about it. We don't equate animal life and human life, and yet clearly the animal's welfare means a lot to God, and that's conveyed in the Torah text itself, right? She, the donkey, saved your life. I, God, decided also to spare your life despite your really abhorrent behavior toward this donkey. And now we're going to move to one other section of Torah, which speaks to animal welfare in general. When you encounter your enemy's ox or ass wandering, you must take it back to him. So this question of how do we treat animals is brought to us through the lens of how do we relate to other human beings. And it makes the point in the kind of extreme example, not simply how do we relate to other human beings, but how do we relate to those whom we hate or who hate us? And is our behavior toward that person's animals, can we get away with treating our enemy's ass or our enemy's ox maybe a little worse than we would treat our allies or our friends? And the answer is actually no. When you see the ass of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless raise it with him. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. Ki gerim hayitam be'eretz Mitzrayim. Now, I skipped a few verses here, and there are a few other things that also have to do with human beings, but I think it's telling that the end of this section is that, reminder that we are meant to have empathy for those who are suffering, because clearly the suffering of animals and even the suffering of the animals of our enemy is meant to give us pause as a people who have endured suffering ourselves. That trope of you have been strangers in the land of Egypt, you were slaves in the land of Egypt, appears more than any other message in Torah, and it's there for a reason. But now I want to look at the Gemara, at the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, because here the rabbis are going to have a discussion about how we're meant to treat animals in our tradition. And I'm going to move us through these texts fairly quickly with your permission. Rav Yehuda said, in the name of Rav, with regard to an animal that fell into an aqueduct, one brings cushions and blankets, and the implication here is and throws them into the ditch and places them beneath the animal in the aqueduct. And if the animal thereby emerges, it emerges. The Gemara then raises an objection from the Tosefta. So the Tosefta is a contemporaneous text to the Mishnah, meaning it's Tanaitic. It comes from the 2nd century of the Common Era or earlier. And it's going to raise a question. The question you can guess because this is from Masechet Shabbat, this is from the section of the Talmud that deals frequently with the laws of Shabbat, is this behavior acceptable? Right? You would think it would be acceptable no matter what, but what about on Shabbat? Are there Shabbat prohibitions that would get in the way of doing this for the animal that's been injured and fallen into this water channel here? So with regard to an animal that fell into an aqueduct on Shabbat, one provides it with sustenance in its place so that it will not die. Sure, you can, bring it food, that's okay. This implies that providing it with sustenance, yes, but wait a second. What about cushions and blankets? No, that really shouldn't be. So we have this objection from the Tosefta that seems to contradict the Mishnah, contemporaneous text, and so therefore having the same legal authority. Maybe you shouldn't do this, okay? And we'll get to why maybe you shouldn't do it later. The Gemara answered, La kasha. No, this is actually not a difficulty. This is not a contradiction in the text. There's room to distinguish between these cases. This case, that is the Tosefta case, about providing the animal with sustenance, with food, that's referring to a case where it's possible to provide the animal with sustenance. With parnassah is the word in Hebrew. That is the other text, the one from the Mishnah, the one about the cushions and blankets, is a case where it is impossible to provide the animal with sustenance. Where it's possible to provide the animal with sustenance, yes, so fine, then you do that. But if it's not possible, then you do the best you can. You provide cushions and blankets to place beneath the animal. Okay? And what's now the crux of the issue? Why would it be that the Gemara would argue that you shouldn't be putting blankets and cushions under the animal? You would think that would be a fine thing to do, along with giving the animal some food and water in order to care for it, even on Shabbat. And now we're going to learn what is the Shabbat prohibition that may be a problem here. Sorry, got my place. The Gemara asks, does he not, by placing the cushions and blankets, negate the vessel's preparedness? Okay, what does that mean, negate the vessel's preparedness? Without going into too many details here, this is what's called a tolada. That is a derivative of an av melacha, that is a prohibition of Shabbat. There are 39 melachot, 39 special labors that were not permitted by Jewish law to perform. And one of them is the prohibition against destroying things. And so a derivative of that, kind of breaking down something which has been constructed, seems to be this notion of negating a vessel's preparedness, okay? The cushions and blankets are no longer fit for their designated use on Shabbat, and this negation of their designed use, this is now the commentary from Adin Steinsaltz, is similar to the prohibited labor of dismantling. Okay, you got it? If you're not supposed to destroy something on Shabbat, and this thing by putting cushions in the water is basically, I mean, who would want to sleep on a mattress once you've put it in an aqueduct, right? It doesn't make for a very effective mattress. So you've ruined the mattress. You're not allowed to ruin things on Shabbat, and therefore you shouldn't do this in order to help the animal. The Gemara answers, Rav holds that negating a vessel's preparedness is prohibited by rabbinic law, but causing a living creature to suffer is midoraita, is a Torah prohibition, and a matter prohibited by Torah comes and overrides a matter prohibited by rabbinic law. Everyone with me on this? Okay, so there are two kinds of prohibitions. There are things that are asur midoraita, that are Torah prohibitions, and there are things that are asur midorabanan, that are rabbinic prohibitions. Rabbinic prohibitions are still prohibitions. However, since it's not a Torah prohibition, the rabbinic prohibition actually gets superseded by another Torah prohibition. And what is that? Tsar ba'alei chaim, causing unnecessary harm or suffering to animals. Here is one of God's creations that's there suffering in the water. There are certain things that we can do to help. We can provide it with sustenance, but also we can provide it with comfort so that it's not being further harmed in the aqueduct. And if we can do that, we should, and if we can do it even on Shabbat, we should do it on Shabbat because taking care of the animal is more important. Now we're going to look at Rambam Maimonides, who has something to say about maybe what's behind this. What's the kind of rationale for treating animals well? Is it simply about, being nice, or is it something actually about the kind of character of the animals that they experience suffering in a way that may be actually somewhat similar to human beings? And Rambam argues that it does. People should be restrained. People should be restrained and prevented from killing the two together in such a manner that the young is slain in the sight of the mother, for the pain of animals under such circumstances is very great. So what Rambam is referring to is the prohibition against slaughtering the mother and the baby in front of one another at the same time. And so Rambam says there is no difference in this case between the pain of human beings and the pain of other living beings, since the love and tenderness of the mother for her young ones is not produced by reason but by imagination. And this faculty exists not only in human beings but in most living beings. So Maimonides is saying something really fascinating here. with regard to this situation about slaughter in front of a family member. And also he brings this with regard to the strange prohibition of shaluach hakein, the shooing away of the mother bird before taking the eggs from the nest that comes in Devarim. Rambam says the reason that we don't do these things is because it's harmful, it's painful, it's traumatizing for a parent, even an animal parent, to witness the suffering of its offspring, or vice versa. We actually have these kinds of ideas codified in codes of Jewish law. So Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed is not a legal code, it's his great philosophical treatise. But here we have the Shulchan Aruch, which borrows on Rambam's and other ideas about this notion of tsar ba'alei chayim, the notion of not causing unnecessary harm to animals. Mutar lomar la'akum. One can ask a Gentile to milk his cow on Shabbat because of tsar ba'alei chayim, because the milk hurts her. So just understand that milking a cow on Shabbat is one of those prohibitions. It's something that we're not supposed to do. Just like riding an animal on Shabbat, you're not supposed to do. And yet, it's permitted to have a Gentile do so on our behalf in order to prevent the animal from suffering. Because if you think about it, it's painful. I've never produced milk, but I understand from creatures who produce milk, human and otherwise, that there's a need to express that milk, and when you don't, it really can be painful. So you do that in order to alleviate the suffering of the animal. But the milk is forbidden to drink on that same day. So yes, you can take the milk, but there are those, but you shouldn't drink it on the same day. You shouldn't benefit from the milk that is at least Jews shouldn't benefit from the milk. They shouldn't be able to consume it because it was something that isn't technically supposed to be done on Shabbat. And there are those, though, who saw that one needs to buy it for a smaller than normal amount from the Gentiles so that it does not appear that they milked it in order to fulfill the needs of the Jews. So maybe even you can, but you should pay below market rate. I think the important takeaway here, though, is that we are to consider the needs of the cow and not just the needs of the human being. And when we get to the next text, we're going to see that what we're trying to do is balance to what extent is the animal kingdom there for the purposes of humanity, and to what extent are they of value in and of themselves, meant to be treated with compassion and dignity. So from Masechet Bava Metzia, this is also from the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, and you'll see that now we're going to move to simply not only alleviating the suffering of the animal, but also what does this do to us as human beings when we cause animal suffering like Bilaam does with his ass, or when we withhold from causing animals unnecessary suffering? Does it do something to us about our own composition? Excuse me. The Gemara stated that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's suffering came upon him due to an incident. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the compiler of the Mishnah, a very important rabbi of the 3rd century. What was that incident that led to his suffering? The Gemara answers there was a certain calf that was being led to slaughter. Now, eating animals is acceptable according to Jewish law. Presumably, the animal is going to be shechted, it's going to be slaughtered in a kosher manner. There's nothing wrong with this according to halacha. The calf went and hung its head on the corner of Rabbi. In other words, the calf is sort of needing some comfort in this moment. It's actually kind of a lovely image. He is weeping, or she is weeping on the garment of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. But Rabbi said to it, "Go, for you were created for this purpose." Right? You came into the world in order to become meat for my Shabbos table. It was said to him, since he was not compassionate toward the calf, let afflictions come upon him. He gets sick. The Gemara explains the sentiment. There's another sentiment where it says, and the afflictions left him due to a different incident. How did his suffering get alleviated? One day the maidservant of Rabbi was sweeping his house. There were young weasels, karkushta, lying about, and she was in the process of sweeping them out. But Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said to her, let them be, as it is written, the Lord is good to all, and God's mercies are over all of God's work. Tov Adonai lakol v'rachamav al kol ma'asav. They said in heaven, since in this instance he is compassionate, he seemed to have learned his lesson, we shall be compassionate on him. And at that moment, his suffering was alleviated. It's not simply about preventing the suffering of the animal for the animal's sake, but it seems to be even our own welfare is dependent on the way we treat animals. Lahavdil, a little different, but I mean quite different. But it does remind me of something that the humorist Dave Barry once wrote. He says, if you meet somebody who's nice to you but mean to the waitress, they're probably not a very good person. Right? And I think there's something similar to this, right? If somebody is sort of nice in ways where they're noticed being nice, but they're mean in the spaces where you might think they could get away with it, maybe that speaks to who they are. But there's also, I think, an important message in this text about tshuva, about human ability to improve ourselves, because Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, he behaves badly the first time, but then he sort of gets it. And when he gets it, and when he changes his behavior, when he does tshuva, when he is compassionate to another animal, at that moment he's accepted and his suffering is alleviated. One final text as we wrap up. From the Shulchan Aruch, a 16th century code of Jewish law that I was quoting from earlier as well. Any action needed for healing or other reasons, there is no prohibition of tsar ba'alei chayim, of causing animals to suffer. And therefore it's permitted to pluck the feathers of a wild goose, and there's no potential problem of tsar ba'alei chayim. So notice that if there are times that we need to provide a benefit to humans, right? Not just a benefit to like it tastes good, but a benefit like, healthcare. This is a text that's often used by bioethicists to speak about, can one experiment on animals in order to alleviate human suffering, to bring about vaccines for diseases and things like that. And it seems that the stated law is, in fact, we can do that. We're allowed to cause animals suffering if it's going to have a direct benefit to human health and welfare and safety. And yet, even in this instance where it's clearly accepted and permitted by the letter of the law, nevertheless, mikom makom ha'olam nimna'im dahave achzariyut. Nevertheless, we really shouldn't do it. Why? Because it's a form of cruelty. In other words, the issue goes beyond halacha to a meta-halachic concern, and that is whenever possible, yes, saving human lives is most important. And if we really need to cause an animal suffering in order to save human lives, we are permitted to do it, maybe even required to do it. However, it's not a good thing. And if we can find any other way, if you can, and we're not talking about like experimentation on animals for creating makeup here, right? I would argue that's clearly prohibited by Jewish law. But even in instances where you can save lives, if there's any other way to avoid doing this, there's something about causing pain to animals that diminishes us as reflections of God in the world. And if we as individuals and we as a society can avoid doing that, all the better for us as people, all the better for someone like Bilaam, that he should learn from his mistakes, all the better for Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, that he should learn from his mistakes, and all the better for us as a community that strives to walk in God's ways, as we learned from the Haftarah about Micha today. Shabbat Shalom, and I hope this